Hello everyone, in this video I'll be completing the official React tutorial. This tutorial is one of the main parts of the official React.js website, and the final result of this tutorial is the working tic-tac-toe game, where you can interact with and play the game, and you will also be able to see the history of your moves and go between them. So the way we'll implement this game is we will have several nested React components. We will be passing props from some components to the others, and finally we will change some of the states of those components. In my opinion, it's a very good tutorial to complete, or at least to look at. The fact that it's such a big part of the main website signifies the importance and attention to it. So while following this tutorial, we can be sure that design techniques used here are the proper ways of creating and using React components. The tutorial is split into 4 parts. First is a quick setup for the React code to work. Second, and the third, is the fundamentals and the most common techniques to make the main part of the tic-tac-toe game to work. And finally, we will have the extension of the tic-tac-toe game to have this time travel. This tutorial doesn't assume any pre-existing React knowledge. However, it would be very helpful for you to have some understanding about HTML and JavaScript, as well as some general programming concepts. In this video, I'll be simply following this tutorial and reiterating some of the points that are given here. So if you're more familiar with React and this tutorial is not very difficult for you, perhaps it would be faster for you to complete this on your own. However, if you prefer video format and would like some explanation of some of the parts of this tutorial, then I hope this video will be helpful for you. So first, let's do the setup for the tutorial. One way to run React code for this tutorial is to simply use the online code editor that has React already set up for you. This is a simple way. However, I would recommend trying to run React locally. It's not very hard if you have Node.js and npm installed. And this is how you would be developing React for bigger applications. So that would be a helpful knowledge to have how to set up React locally. So let's start with doing this. I already have npm and node installed. So I can just run npx create react app, my app. And that will take about a minute to create the basic structure for the React. So from there, we would be able to easier develop our React components. All right, it's done. So now we can navigate to our app and change the initial code that was provided to us. So first we go to src and delete all of the files that were initially given to us. And then we just need to create 2 files. One of them is the CSS file, and the other is the main JavaScript file that we will be working in. Then we can go out of the folder and open our project. So here we will be interacting only with one file. This is index.js. We have index.css, and we will paste some of the provided code there so that we don't have to worry about displaying our board properly. This is nothing React specific. This is basic CSS, and we don't want to spend time on this, so we'll be just using the existing code. And for JavaScript code, we will actually also have some of the pre-built code, and we will later explain what it is doing, and we'll start from here. So this is the start code, and the last thing that we need to add to start running our skeleton code is to add those 3 lines to the beginning of our index.js file. So here we're just importing React and importing the styles. And that's enough for our skeleton code to work. So let's try running this. We can do it simply by using npm start. And it is working. It's a simple board. We cannot interact with it, so clicking on it doesn't do anything. But this is from where we will start, and we will explain how this works. And actually, from here on, we will not need our terminal. We will not our index.css file, because we will not be changing this. The only file that we will be working on during this tutorial is this index.js file. So we can even hide the sidebar. So let's go back to the tutorial. Here, we started successfully on localhost, and we're good to go. So first, before explaining the code, let's talk about React in general, how that works. And this is a very general overview of what React is. So basically, React is a JavaScript library that allows you to create isolated small pieces of code called components to create more complex UI interfaces. And React is known to be very efficient and very good performing library. One of the main kinds of React components is the React.component subclasses. So here we import React, and then by accessing its .component attribute, we can extend it and create our own React components. So here, shopping list is a React component class that returns a view to display. So if you're creating simple React components, then this could be a common structure for you. So here we have, so to say, wrapper around this HTML-like code that creates this component, and then finally that would return the view or description of what we want to see on the screen. So this looks familiar, it looks like HTML, but it's actually JSX, and JSX has the full power of JavaScript. So basically we can use any JavaScript inside those HTML tags like here, and it's a very convenient way of creating React components. But in theory you could do something like this, but it's much harder to read. So here our example shopping list component creates those div and list components, and we can use it by simply writing this, and we can customize that by passing parameters to it. So here, after creating this component, we can use it like this, and then our component inside will have this.props, and whatever property we will pass to it, so in this case it's called name, then that will be accessible here. So that will be simply mark in this case, right? So this is the basic structure. We'll be using JSX that looks similar to HTML. We can have a very simple component if we want to, but we can start passing parameters, we can start passing functions, we will be nesting components within each other, and finally adding other methods besides render. So that can become quite complex, but this is in general how React components will look like. So that's a very brief introduction to React component, and now let's finally look at the starter code and see what is given to us already. So basically our old React code for this project is in this one file, index.js, and we start by importing React and React DOM. So React is what we'll be using to create components, and React DOM we'll be using only once to finally render our game on the screen. So this basically takes the components that we want to render and the location where we want to put it. So we'll not be needing much of the React DOM here. Okay, now let's look at the components that we have. So we have only 3 components: square, board, and game. And game is the outer element that is rendered on the screen. And so far the game is a bunch of divs, and inside one of the divs we have the board. Everything else doesn't really do anything, and we have some CSS styles applied to those divs. Then we can look at the board. Board has one method, and it has render method. So render returns, again, a div with 9 elements inside it. Again, at this point it doesn't really do much, so we just call 9 times this function, and basically it just creates a square. So at this point we pass a parameter, but we don't even do anything with this here. So that could be just replaced like this, and that wouldn't really change anything. And we have a status for the text, and finally we have our square component, the innermost component, and again it's just one button that doesn't have anything in it, and it is styled somehow with the starter styles. So again, since the square doesn't do anything and here we are not passing anything, we could just like simply take this and put it over here, and that would be essentially the same thing, right? We just abstract it out. So as you can see, we already have some React structure. We have our biggest element game that has inside a board, and the board has 9 squares inside it. But they don't really do anything, they don't interact with each other, and we will be changing this so that we will be able to create a working tic-tac-toe game. So first, let's start with learning about the props. So here, when we're creating our squares, we're passing a number to every method call, but we're not doing anything with this number. So we can change this. We can create a prop value and pass that so that the square would be receiving this value. And then here, once we receive it, we need to do something with this, and we can access it by using this.props and then whatever the name that we call this prop. And once we save it, we can see that we correctly passed them and those props were received by the component. So this is one of the main ways how React components interact with each other. So we have outer component that has components inside, and we pass data from outer component to inner components by having this props, and then we access it by this.props and then the keyword. So we can see that we changed our board so that we can see those numbers. But it's not very useful for our tic-tac-toe game. What we actually want is for squares to react to our clicking. So to make our squares respond to our clicks, we can have the onClick method in the button. So let's add this. Basically, onClick will be receiving a function, and this function for now will be a simple alert. So every time we click our square, we would be getting this alert. All right, let's save this, and every time we click, we get the alert. However, again, it's not what we want to do, so let's see how we can improve this. Here we're having this function syntax. However, usually it's more convenient to use the arrow notation, like here. So let's replace this. Here it's important to notice that we want to pass the function and not immediately invoke it. So if we omit this, then immediately our function would be called whenever we pass this parameter, and this is not what we want. We want to pass the function definition and call it every time we click. So now let's make the square components to remember that we clicked them so that they would display this X mark. And to do this, we have to use the state. This is another core concept. So the way we will do this is we'll create this.state object in the constructor of every React component where we want to have state, and we want the state to be private to every component. So we don't want to change that from outside or from inner component. To create the state object, we need to do several things. First, we have to have the constructor in our component. So here we will create constructor, and to be able to access state, we have to have it stored as a part of this, and to have the access to this, we have to have the super. So this is a necessary part of creating the state. So we always have to have super, and usually we want to use props. So we'll have props in the super and props passed to the constructor. And finally, we can create our state. And in the state, we can store as many keys and values as we want, but for now, we'll just start with one value. So if we save this, then nothing will change because we just create those internal variables and we don't really use them. So now we have to set this state, and let's see how we can do this. So now, instead of just blindly showing whatever was passed to our square, we want to first set the state and then show whatever is in this state. This way we would be able, so to say, remember whether the square was clicked or not. So let's start with replacing props with state. So again, this is the same state here. So at first that would be null. And now whenever we click our square, instead of alerting a message, we want to change our state. We have a built-in set state method. Here we'll pass the name of the state value and the updated value. Right, so this.setState would set this.state.value to x whenever it's clicked. And finally, since our button becomes too long, we can simply split that into 2 lines, because in the future perhaps we will be adding more to this, so let's have it on multiple lines. So these are the only 2 things that we changed. Now instead of alerting, we update the variable and then we display the value of this variable. So if we save this, we no longer just pass whatever is passed here, 0, 1, 2, 3, and if we click this, now we set the variable to x and then we show that it's x, right? So that works. So then tutorial teaches us about the developer tools. You can download a Chrome extension for React code, and that would be more easier to inspect this, but here it's fairly simple, so we will not be using this. So the next thing that we will be doing is to alternate placing X and O's on the board. So far we just place X's. So now we can think about how to design our React code. To determine a winner, we can have the board to ask every one of its 9 squares for their values. Are they X, nothing, or O? And if the values that would be returned are such that there is a winner on the board, then we could return a winner. However, while it's possible, it's probably not the best design approach. It would be better to store the values of the squares inside the board itself, and the board then would be able to tell to squares which values to display. So here we'll be lifting up the state. So previously we had a state inside the square in our innermost component, and we want to move it up to the board so that the board will have the state with the values for each square, and then those values will be passed like here so that the squares would display X, O, or nothing. So let's see how we can do this. Similarly to how we did this for a square, we can create the constructor for the board. And again, if we want to access this and ultimately this.state, we need to have super. And similarly, we just create this state object. And instead of just value, we'll have the object of all squares. So that will be 9-element array filled with nulls for now. And we need to pass props to the constructor too. Now, once we have this state of squares ready, then instead of hard-coding those values, we want to pass the values according to what we have stored in this state. So let's see how we can do this. So this is how we want to use our squares state variable. So this is 9-element array, and each value corresponds to a value in our resulting board. So now, instead of the square determining by itself which value to show, we will change it back to showing what the props are telling the square to show. The props is what is provided by the parent component, or the board in this case. And we would need to change our render square method, because previously we were just passing a value from 0 to 9, but instead of that we want to pass the value in the squares state variable, and I would be as simply an index in this array. So instead of I, we'll have this.state to access the state, and squares is the name of the array, and I is the index in this array. We'll also now need to handle the click on the squares. Previously, we were handling the click within the square component, and it would just change this value. However, now we have the state outside of the square, inside the board, so the board should handle the click. And we can do it by having onClick method passed to the square as a prop. Again, we can separate into multiple lines our component for better readability. OnClick would be, again, an arrow function. Click of I. And we need to add the parentheses to the return method so that JavaScript would handle that correctly. Now we've made changes to the board, and now we have to correctly handle those changes inside the square. So first is we need to replace the state value with a props value, as we had at the very beginning. And also we need to replace setState method when we click with props on click. And finally, since we're no longer using the state for the square component, we can delete the constructor. So now our square correctly handles the input from the outside board, and we're no longer handling the click from the inside of the square. It's more of a calling the click that is passed to us. So basically we're passing a function to our square, this onClick, and this onClick is this dot handle click. So basically when clicking on the square, we'll be calling handle click function. So let's define this function. So in handle click function, we want to update square's state variable so that whenever we click a certain square, we update the corresponding value in this array. To do so, we can define our handle click function that takes the index as the parameter, the index of the array value that we want to update. And the interesting thing that we would do here is we would copy the array, and we would modify the copied version. And we would talk later about why we want to do this. And we would modify the ith element. At first we would just set that to x. Finally, we update this squares variable with our updated array. Okay, now let's try saving and running this updated code. So when I click the squares correctly, we're displaying the updated values. So let's look again how that works. So at first we have this board that has this squares state variable, and then we will update that every time the square component is clicked. So when we click a square, we call this onClick function that calls this.props.onClick, and this is the function that is passed to it from board. And from board, what we pass is function that is this.handleClick with the index. And this function is here. This function takes the existing array and copies it, and then updates the corresponding value at the given index. And then once it's done, the React realizes that another prop that we're passing to square, that is value, has also changed. So now this.state.squares of I, of the clicked square, is now a different value, if previously that was null and now it's x. So basically React will re-render the square and will pass to it x from this location of the array, and x will be rendered as the content of the button. So this how this works now, and seems that it's working correctly as we intended. So next tutorial talks about why immutability is important and why it's a better practice to keep your variables and arrays immutable and create the new instances whenever possible. So the basic idea is that it often will make your code simpler to implement, and we'll see that when we'll be extending our tic-tac-toe game to have this jump back feature. Also, detecting features for React is much easier when we just create new objects, because otherwise React would have to go through every element in the mutatable array and trying to check whether that changed or not. And if it's easy to determine when the object changed, it's also easy to determine for React when we have to re-render the component or not. So basically that improves the performance of our code. So now we'll be learning about function components, and we will change square to be one of them. So basically a function component is just a simpler way to create a component that doesn't have its own state, and usually it behaves purely, meaning that given the same input, it should have the same output. So we can change this square component to be a function component now. It's a function square that just takes props and returns. So apart from changing the class definition and removing the render method, we also would need to change the way how onClicked is passed. So here basically we would have a shorter version of the passing of the function because we don't need to worry about this. So now that will become simply props.onClick without the parentheses and also props.value. We can save this to check if it still works, and it does work as it was before. So next, let's add the functionality of taking turns. Previously, we were just placing x's all the time, and now we also want to be able to change between x and o. We can do this by simply creating a Boolean variable, x is next, and flipping it every time we click on our board. So at first, we will start with x, and then in handle click, we would have to change this variable. So now, instead of always setting the square's array value at index I to x, we can set the value to x or to o is next, and if the value of the boolean is true, then we'll put x, and if not, we'll put o. So whenever we click our squares, we also need to flip this value. So in this.state, we will assign x.isNext to the opposite value that it was before. And let's put that on multiple lines for a better readability. So that should be outside. Alright, so every time we call handle click, we'll not only update the squares array, but we will also update this Boolean variable that will be later used to determine whether to place x or o. So let's try saving this and see if this works. Cool. So that does work. So we're basically flipping our variable and setting the value that currently want to place. Oh, and actually let's change the status. So we have this text next player. So in the status variable, so far we just had this hard-coded, but let's change that to dynamically changing string. So let's save this. And now whenever we click, it shows who will be the next player. So that's cool. So this is the code that we currently have. And finally, let's determine who's the winner in our game. To do so, we will use this helper function. We'll just actually copy and paste this. This is not React specific, it's just a JavaScript function that takes the array as the input. And we have this list of possible positions for winning. So to win, you either have to fill the first row, the second, or the columns, or the diagonals. And then for every line that can be used for winning, we would assign A, B, C variables to the values at that line. For example, for this array, we would assign here null, null, and X. And for each of them, we will be always checking whether the first value is defined, it's not null, and whether the other two values are equal to the first value. So if that's the case, that means that the whole line, either row, column, or diagonal, is filled with the same value, either X or O, and then we can return this value, X or O, meaning we have a winner. And we will be calling this function every time we update our board. So again, it's not React specific code, so we can just use this. So first, let's update the board's render function so that we would correctly show the status of the winner if we have one. So let's go to the board, and in render method, we will create this winner variable that would be either null if we don't have a winner, or a value of the winner, X or O. And we will be passing our array of squares every time. And those squares will be updated every time we click, right? So we're already updating those squares, so all we need to do is just pass them to the function. And our status now is not a constant, it will be changing. And if the winner is not null, meaning we finally had someone to fill a row or a column or a diagonal, we'll update the status to be winner plus the value that is returned from the function. And if we don't have a winner, then basically we'll have our old status, who is the next player. And also we want to stop playing the game if we already got a winner. So basically in handle click, we will always check whether we have a winner, and if so, we will just return and we will not proceed to modifying our states. Let's add this. Just return. All right, and that should be it. Let's save and test. Okay, there is a typo. And let's see if we get the winner. Yes, that's O, and also our handle click now just returns since we already have a winner, so clicking doesn't really change the state and does not update the values. And that's basically it. Let's see how that works. So at first, our React renders the game component, which itself doesn't really do anything at this point. We just return a board with some formatting. And then our board has some things. So first we create a state for our board, which stores the array of squares to remember which square contains X, which contains O, or which is empty. And we have a flip Boolean value to remember which value we should place next. Then we have our handle click function that updates the squares that we're currently having. So we just copy the squares, and then we update the value at the given index according to the Boolean value of what is next. And finally, after updating this, we set the state, because the way we store the values is in this .state. Then we have our render function that has two components. One is status. This is this text on the top, which is determined depending on whether the winner variable that is returned from calculate winner is null or not null. And then we render this status, and then we render 9 squares. And thus, to render those 9 squares, we call the method with the index of that square. And then this index I is passed to both determine the value, right? So the value of the square is the value at array that state that squares at index I, and also we pass the onClick function that also needs to know which index the square is, so that it would be correctly handled when we click this square. And finally, our square is a fairly simple function component which doesn't store any state, doesn't store any information, basically just shows whatever it's told to show. We have this onClick method that calls another function that was passed to this square component, and we just show the value which was passed. So this is a fairly simple React code, but it follows good design techniques suggested by the developers of React. So potentially, maybe we could smash all of our code and components into one big component. Maybe we wouldn't have this square at all, and we would just paste that in the board, but that would be not the best design. And also we could ask the square for the values and determine the winner based on what is returned from the square. Again, it's better to have this state stored at the board and then just tell the square what to display. So this way we have a working tic-tac-toe game, and that's the end for the main part of the tutorial. But in this video we'll do one more thing for our tic-tac-toe game. We'll add time travel, the ability to move between moves. So our game will remember which moves we made, and we will be able to go back and forth between them. So the idea behind this approach is not very difficult. We will simply create an array, another variable, that will store the states at each point of time. So first we would have an empty board, then if we click in the middle we will create another array, and we would add that to our history array, and so on. And so basically, knowing which move we want to go to, we'll just simply go to the corresponding array, and we will display this at our board. And now we'll be facing another design decision, is where to store the history state variable. And the way we will do it is we will lift up the state again. So currently we have this game component that doesn't really do anything, but we will store the history data inside the state of the game component. And this is the process similar to what we did previously, lifting up the state from square to the board, because here the board is responsible only for the displaying of the squares on the board, and we don't want the board to also remember all of the different moves. And by storing the history data inside the game, we can control the board component. So again, we will make the game component responsible for setting up the values in the board, and the board would be responsible for setting up the values in the square. So it's a bit of a hierarchy here, but it is the best decision for designing our flow of data. So to store history in our game component, again, we have to create this state variable, and as we did this previously, we just need to create a constructor that gets props, and inside this constructor we call super to have access to this, and in our state we will be storing history variable, which is an array of dictionaries. Like we saw before, we want to have a dictionary for every state of the board. So if we do 10 moves, then we would have 10 dictionaries, and each of them would store the position of the elements of the squares. So that is an array of 9 elements filled with nulls at first. That will be our initial point in the history, empty board. And since we're lifting up the state, we also want to move the isNext variable to the game component. And again, we will be just reporting this value to the board. So now we need to change the board component to correctly handle the changes and to correctly receive the data from the game component that will be passed to the board component. So first we will delete the constructor in board because again, we remove the state, so we don't need to store anything in the board. Everything will be stored in the game. Since we now don't have a state, we don't determine the values that we pass to the square from the state. We determine them from the props, so we also need to modify this. And also we'll be changing the handle click function, so we need to modify that to the function that would be provided to board by the game component. We will be getting that from props. So now our component looks like this, and there are a few other things that we need to change. Since now the game component will be responsible for the management of data, we want to move up some of the functionalities that we had previously in board, and we want to move them up to the game component. So first, let's move the display of status from board to the game. So first, let's move the status functionality from the render method of the board to the render method of the game. So that should be pretty much unchanged. And we also want to create 2 new variables. One is history and the other is current. History is just basically to not have to write this.state dot every time we want to use this history array. And current is to display where we're currently at our board. So that would be basically the last element in our history array. So let's write this. History. That would be the last element, right? And since we're managing the board from the game component, we want to pass the data correctly to the board. So basically our board would be receiving 2 things, similarly as we did when we were managing square component from the board. We're passing the data in the onClick event. So the squares would be our current.squares, and onClick, again, similarly as we did in the board. That would be this handle click that we would need to define. And since we moved up the status, we want to display that here, right? So it's basically the variable status that we created here. And since we're displaying status in the game component, we don't need this status in the board component anymore. Finally, we need to implement the handle click method so that every time we click a square, we are correctly updating and passing the information from components to other components. And the structure of the handle click would be slightly different because now we have this history variable that stores the history of moves. So let's remove the handle click function from the board because we will not be using it, and paste that into the game component and change that accordingly to our structure of the component. So first of all, we don't store squares state variable as we did before. Instead, we are storing the history, and the current element of the history is from where we'll be accessing the squares. So basically, in our structure, we have this array of dictionaries, and For example, if we're at move 1, the current will be this, and current.squares would be this array. So this is how we will be accessing it. So let's update this. To do the current, and again for the shorthand, and finally we need to update this.state method that changes the data whenever we click a square, and we still flip the Boolean value as we did before, but here instead of assigning array of squares to a new array of squares, we will be changing the history. We will be adding an element to the history array. And we want to do that without mutating the existing array, so we'll use concat squares. So now this handle click should correctly handle our new structure of storing the positions of the moves in history array and correctly retrieving them to then pass to the board like this. And now let's see what else we should do to show the past moves. So to do so, we'll be creating a moves variable that will be created by mapping the steps and moves from the history to the description. And then we will be using this moves variable to use it in here to display which are available moves we can click to move between. So let's do this. So now we should have this moves variable that has the set of available moves, and the description is just basically our text to display on this button, and the button action will be this.jump to, and depending on which move we're on, we will perform a different action. And this is basically the last piece that we need to implement. So let's go further, and here we are putting those moves besides the board. So this is the last piece of our change of the structure. So here in moves we're creating buttons, and one of the common warnings that you can get when developing React components is that each element should have a unique key prop. And this is used by React to understand what was changed in the list of elements and how to correctly render them and display the changes accordingly. So now let's add the key to our list items that we create. We can just identify that by move. And let's start with adding step number. So the step number is where we're currently at. So step number will be one of the variables in our state because we want to remember this information. And this is when we use state variables, right? So now let's define this jump to function. So here we're just passing the provided number to setState function so that we update the corresponding state variable. And we also will, instead of flipping every time we click on a square, we will just calculate the is x is next Boolean depending on whether the number of steps is even or odd. Now we need to update handle click method so that whenever we click a square, we correctly update the current step number, because step number variable shows which step we're currently at, which move we're currently at. So since we're progressing through our steps when we click on squares, we need to update this variable. So that would be the length of the new history that we will be also updating. So basically we just update the history and then we update the step number by the new length of the history. And also we want to slice the history from the beginning to the current step number so that when we go back in time and then make a move, then we remove the remaining steps and kind of start again from that current position. So here, instead of just .history, we'll be having a slice from the beginning to the current step number. And then finally, one last thing is that in render method, instead of rendering the very last element in our history, we will be rendering the element that is we're currently at, right? Like when we click the button to move to a certain step, we will be updating this variable, and according to this variable, we will be setting up this current variable, and this way we'll be showing what we currently clicked on. So let's do this. Instead of the last element in the history, we'll be just doing step number. All right, and that's it. So that should be working tic-tac-toe game. Let's see if that works. Let's save this. And I forgot a comma, so let's add this. Okay, and also I think I made a mistake here. Here I guess I need to change this. All right, so let's see if it works. Okay, so let's see. The winner is calculated, and then if we click to move, then it does jump to our states and where we were. And if we start all over again, then the remaining of the history is deleted because we take a slice up to that point and we just concatenate to a newly created history. And cool, seems to be working. And again, let's quickly review how we've done this and how our code is structured. So at first we were provided with a skeleton for our app, right? So that was simple code that didn't work, but we already had some components defined and we had CSS that we don't need to worry about. And then we created a nested structure of React components. So again, first we rendered the game. So the game is basically all our web page has. But our game now is a fairly complicated component. And the game itself renders the board component. And the board component then fairly simply renders 9 square components. And square components are just displaying whatever is passed to them and handle the click. So let's go from square from inside to outside. So again, we didn't change much for the square. It's just handling the provided function and firing it up. But it's kind of interesting nested structure of functions, right? That here, what we pass, the function that is provided to square is this function. And this function is what is provided to board from game. So basically it's multiple levels of passing the function. But we kind of have to do this because we want to identify when a certain square is clicked, and when the square is clicked, then we want to modify the state object in game component, right? And to be able to know what happened inside the inner square, we have to keep passing this function downside inwards, and that makes this kind of a nested structure. And similarly with props, right? So the square shows the value that was given to it, and the value that the board gives to the square is actually also a prop that is provided to the board from the game, right? So again, a nested structure. But the board itself is kind of an intermediate component that doesn't do much, right? So basically the render method is just creates 9 squares and passes the parameters to those squares. Fairly simple component. And now our game component is now the most complicated component that has all the logic inside it. So Here, first we create the constructor that stores 3 variables in its state. The main one is the history, is the array of objects, and each object is the current state of the board at that move, right? So that could be up to 10 different elements in that array. And then we start with step number 0, that is the step we're currently on, and this is the index that we'll be using to access the corresponding value in the history. And then we have this Boolean value to determine who goes next, right? We also will be flipping this in the when we handle the clicks, right? Then we have handle click function, right? Again, this fired by the square, which then is passed to board and then passed to game. And here we get the history from the state. Then we get the last element of that history, and then from that board we take the array of squares. Then we check whether there is a winner on that board, right? Like we have this JavaScript function that was given to us just to check whether any given row, any line that we can use for winning is filled with the same values, either X's or O's. And if that's the case, we return, and basically we stop processing the clicks. So if we get a winner, then clicking doesn't really do anything. And then in handle click, every time whenever we click, we flip the Boolean value. No, actually, we set the value at the squares array to either X or O corresponding to the Boolean value, and then we flip this value every time we click in this.state method, right? This .setState modifies the state variables, and all 3 variables we want to modify every time we click a square, right? So we concatenate new squares to the history, right? Like we have this new move that we want to add, and we modify the step number, right? Like our history length increased, we got to the new step, to the new move, and we want to update this value too. Then we have our render method that returns basically 3 things, right? This is the board, and we pass the correct values, current squares array, and the onClick handle click function. And here we also pass the status, this just string, who is next or who is the winner, and the moves, this list of allied elements with buttons, right? So this is what our render function returns, our render method. And to correctly return this, we need to have some logic inside the render method. And our render method, again, takes the variables that we need. We get the history, this array of objects. Then we get the current position in our history. So depending on the step number, it's either the last element when we're moving or not, like some of the intermediate steps if we click to one of the buttons. And then the winner is either null or X or O. Then the moves is we create this list of ally elements that we then append that to our ordered list in the return of the render method. And the way we create it is that we have this description part that is used as text. we just want to alternate between go to move X and go to game start. That's why we have two different ones. And we have the move index that we use to pass to jump to method so that we correctly jump to the appropriate place in our history. And of course, we have our status. Fairly simple. We just see whether we have a winner or not, and we show correctly the text. And our very last function is jump to. Basically, jump to takes the step index, and we update the step number state variable to this given step, and we flip our x is next boolean if we need to. And the way the React works is that when we change this variable, right, our render function says that this step number variable was updated. So therefore it updates this current value because this uses step number variable. And then winner also uses this current variable, and more importantly, current variable is used by board, right? So basically the whole board will be rendered because there is this sequence of elements that use one of the variables that we update, right? So we basically just update one variable, but React has this chain of updates that will update this first and then update current, and since current was updated, then this value passed to board will be updated, and then the whole board will be updated with the new values that we want to use. So I think this is pretty cool that React works this way. So yeah, this is pretty much it. This is the end of the tutorial. Here in the tutorial they provide some of the ideas how you could extend this, and I guess that would be also very useful to learn how you could extend the functionality having this established good design provided to you by developers of React. To learn more about the React, you can read the more extensive and detailed docs part of the website that talks about the specific features and methods of the React. So this is it for the intro tutorial. Thank you very much for joining me in completing it. I really hope that was helpful to you, and I wish you luck in mastering React. All right, thanks.